The first thing I noticed was the empty space on the shelf. My mother's journal was gone. Then, the smell hit me from the kitchen. My coque au vin. The one I'd been perfecting for weeks. But I wasn't the one cooking it. My feet felt like lead blocks as I moved toward the doorway. The air was thick with the scent of thyme, bay leaf, and the rich, wine-infused broth that I knew better than my own reflection. It was my mother's soul, simmering in a pot. My soul. And standing there at my stove, wearing my apron, was my cousin, Sasha. She stirred the stew with my mother's wooden spoon, the one with the little burn mark on the handle from a long-forgotten accident. She hummed a tuneless little song, oblivious, or pretending to be. With Sasha, you never knew. The camera on the tripod next to her was a new, cruel detail. Its little red light was on. Recording. "What are you doing?" My voice was a crackle of static, barely there. Sasha looked up, and her face broke into a smile so wide and bright it was grotesque. It was the smile of a predator that had just cornered its prey. "Oh, hey, you're up early. Just getting a little practice in for my submission video. What do you think? The lighting is perfect, right?" My eyes darted from the pot, to the camera, to the counter. My meticulously chopped mirepoix, my pearl onions glistening in butter, my hand-cured lardons. And there, lying open next to a bowl of flour, was my mother's leather-bound journal. Her elegant cursive filled the page, the ink slightly faded. Sasha was using it as a prop. "That's my dish," I said. The words felt foreign, like I was speaking a language I didn't understand. "That's my mother's recipe." Aunt Carol walked in then, a cup of coffee in her hand. She surveyed the scene with a placid, approving look. "Don't be so dramatic, Ilara. Sasha was just inspired by you. Isn't that what family is for? To inspire each other?" "She stole it," I whispered, my gaze fixed on Sasha. "She stole my entry for the Golden Ladle." Sasha let out a theatrical sigh, turning to the camera with a put-upon expression. "See what I have to deal with? So much jealousy. I just have a natural talent, I guess. It's in my blood." She winked at the lens. My blood. It was my blood. It was my mother's blood, not hers. Not their blood, which felt thin and cold and venomous. Ever since my parents died in that awful wreck on the interstate, their house had become mine, a house where I was the unpaid maid, the silent cook, the ghost that kept everything running. Aunt Carol had taken me in with pronouncements of love and duty, but her embrace felt like a cage from day one. All my parents' life insurance, my inheritance, went into a trust she managed. A trust that paid for Sasha's new car, her designer clothes, her effortless, sun-drenched life, while I wore second-hand sweaters and worked a part-time job at a diner to pay for my own culinary school supplies. The only thing I had for myself, the one thing they couldn't touch, was my mother's legacy. Her passion for food was the only real inheritance she'd left me. And that journal? It was her heart, transcribed in flour and butter and love. It was everything. The Golden Ladle Scholarship wasn't just a competition to me. It was the escape hatch. A full ride to the most prestigious culinary institute in Paris and an apprenticeship under Chef Antoine Dubois. It was a one-way ticket out of this suffocating beige-coloured life. It was my chance to finally breathe. For the past month, I had lived and breathed that coque au vin. I'd spent my diner wages on the best Pinot Noir, on organic mushrooms from the farmer's market, on the perfect cut of chicken. I'd stayed up until 3 a.m. night after night, tweaking, tasting, scribbling notes in the margins of my mother's journal, having a conversation with her across time. I was so close. The dish was perfect. The submission video was planned out in my head, shot by shot. A tribute to her, to us. And now, Sasha was filming my tribute as her own. "Get away from that stove," I said, my voice finding a sliver of steel. Sasha just laughed. Make me. You know, I have to thank you. I was going to make my usual avocado toast, but this is so much more authentic. She said the word authentic as if it were a joke. Carol, please, I begged, turning to my aunt. My last, desperate hope. You know how much this means to me. You know what I've been working on. Aunt Carol took a slow sip of her coffee. She looked at me over the rim of the mug, her eyes cold and flat. Ilara, I think you're having one of your episodes. You've been under a lot of stress. Maybe you're confused. Sasha has been working on this recipe for ages. She was telling me all about her creative process just last night. The lie was so bald, so effortless, it knocked the wind out of me. They had planned this. Sasha's sudden interest in my cooking the last few days, her questions, her praise. It was all reconnaissance. My journal, I choked out, pointing a trembling finger at the counter. My mother's handwriting. Sasha picked it up, handling it with a careless familiarity that made my stomach churn. She flipped through the pages. Oh, this old thing? I found it in a box of your mum's stuff. It's got some cute ideas in it. I thought I'd use it to add a little emotional backstory to my video. It's all about the narrative, you know. The world tilted. The floor seemed to drop away from my feet. It wasn't just about stealing a recipe anymore. They were stealing my mother. They were stealing my grief, my love, my last connection to her, and packaging it into a cheap, sentimental story for a scholarship video. They were erasing me. I lunged. I don't even remember making the decision. My body just moved, a raw animal instinct to protect the last sacred thing I had. I reached for the journal, my fingers brushing the worn leather cover. Sasha was faster. She sidestepped, holding the book aloft like a trophy. Temper. Aunt Carol stepped between us, placing a firm, heavy hand on my chest. That's enough. You're upsetting your cousin before her big day. Go to your room. Now. It's my big day, I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat, raw and ragged. It's mine. Not anymore, Sasha said softly, a final, triumphant little smile playing on her lips. She turned back to the camera. Okay, where were we? So, as I was saying, this recipe has been in my family for generations, passed down from my beloved aunt. I stumbled backward, out of the kitchen, the smell of my own dreams now choking me like smoke. I couldn't breathe. I grabbed my keys, my worn-out sneakers, and ran. I ran out of the house, into the cold morning air, with their laughter echoing behind me. I didn't know where I was going. I just drove. Tears streamed down my face, hot and blinding. Every road seemed to lead back to that kitchen, to that smug smile, to the desecration of my mother's memory. I had nothing left. They had finally taken everything. My car seemed to drive itself, my subconscious taking me to the one place that felt like a sanctuary, the culinary school. It was deserted, the sun barely up. I sat in the empty parking lot, the engine off, the silence inside the car a roaring in my ears. I was numb, a hollowed-out shell. A tap on the window made me jump. It was Professor Albright, my instructor. He was an old, stoic man, with flour permanently dusted on his eyebrows and kind eyes that saw more than most people. He must have been coming in early to prep for the morning class. He gestured for me to roll down the window. Everything all right, Ilara? You look like you've seen a ghost. I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, a fresh wave of sobs racking my body. He sighed, a deep, patient sound. He didn't press for details. He just looked at me, his gaze taking in my tear-streaked face and the frantic, desperate energy radiating off me. The deadline for the Golden Ladle is noon today, he said, his voice gentle. I let out a harsh, broken laugh. I know. It doesn't matter anymore. It always matters, he replied simply. He looked at the sky, then back at me. Talent isn't a recipe in a book, Ilara. It's in your hands. It's in your palate. It's in your gut. No one can steal that from you. They did, I whispered. They took it all. He was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled a key from his pocket. I was coming in to work on a new duck confit technique. I have the pantry unlocked. It's stocked with everything you could possibly need. Foie gras, truffles, saffron. The good stuff we save for the advanced classes. He held the key out to me. A recipe is a roadmap. It isn't the journey. You have 5 hours. Create something that isn't in a book. Create something that is only in you. Show them what can't be stolen. I stared at the small brass key in his palm. It looked like an impossible thing, a lifeline. My hands were shaking. My mind was a complete blank, a scorched earth of grief and rage. Cook? Now? How could I possibly cook now? But then I thought of Sasha's smirking face. I thought of my aunt's cold eyes. I thought of them taking my mother's memory and twisting it into a lie. The numbness in my chest flickered, and something else took its place. A tiny, hot coal of pure, defiant rage. He was right. They could steal the book. They could steal the dish. But they couldn't steal the fire my mother had passed down to me. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and took the key. It felt heavy, like the weight of a final, desperate choice. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a recipe. All I had was a ghost to honor and a war to win. My name is Eleanor, though no one has called me that in a very long time. For the last 40 years, I've been Ellie, or Mom, or Honey. My name, the one my mother gave me, feels like a formal dress packed away in an attic trunk, something that belonged to a different woman from a different time. When I look in the mirror now, I see the soft lines of 62 years etched around my eyes, a roadmap of every late night, every worried vigil, every burst of laughter that ever echoed through this house. This house, it's been my world. I can trace my life in its very floorboards. There's the faint scorch mark near the hearth from when our son, Michael, tried to make campfire toast indoors when he was 6. And over there, by the bay window, is a series of tiny pencil marks on the wall, charting the heights of Michael and then his sister Chloe. I stopped marking them when they shot past my own height, as if my job as their son, the center of their universe, was done. They had outgrown me. It's quiet now. The echoes are all that's left. Before all this, before the quiet, I was a girl with dreams scribbled in the margins of notebooks. I wanted to be a botanist. I loved the secret, silent language of plants, the way a seed held the entire promise of a towering oak. I was good at it too. My professors said I had a gift, a gentle hand. But then I met Richard. He wasn't like a quiet, patient seed. He was a storm. A brilliant, charismatic, wonderful storm that swept me off my feet. He talked about the future not in whispers, but in declarations. He was going to build an empire, he'd say, his eyes burning with a fire that I was sure could light up the world. And I wanted to be part of that light. I wanted to tend to that fire. We married young. I was 22, he was 24. We had nothing but a tiny 4th-floor walk-up apartment where the pipes clanked at night and the sirens were our lullaby. But it felt like a palace. We'd lay on a mattress on the floor, our fingers intertwined, and he'd map out his future on the cracked ceiling. A law firm, a partnership, a house with a yard, 2 kids and a golden retriever. He painted a masterpiece of a life, and he handed me the brush to help fill in the colours. My own dreams, the ones about cataloguing rare orchids in a humid greenhouse, began to seem small and selfish in comparison. How could my quiet study of petals compete with the grand architecture of his ambition? His dream was a family dream, a we dream. Mine was just an I dream. So I packed my textbooks into a box. I told myself it was temporary, just until he got on his feet. The box is still in the attic, sealed with 40 years of dust. Richard was my everything, my sun, my moon, my stars. I trusted him with a totality that, looking back, feels terrifyingly naive. I trusted his judgment, his promises, his version of our future. When he said we needed to move for his first big job, I left my family and friends without a second thought. When he said my part-time job at the library was a distraction from what was truly important, creating a stable, loving home for him to return to, I believed him. I handed in my notice. My world, once stretching towards distant jungles and academic halls, began to shrink until its borders were the white picket fence he eventually built for us. And for a long time, it was a beautiful, gilded cage I didn't even know I was in. I poured myself into being the perfect wife, the perfect mother. I became a master of 1,000 invisible arts. I could gauge Richard's mood by the sound of his key in the lock. A sharp, quick turn meant a good day at the office. A slow, heavy one meant I needed to have his favourite scotch waiting. I learned to host dinner parties for his partners that were exercises in quiet diplomacy, ensuring every glass was full, every conversation was smooth, and I was a charming but unobtrusive accessory on his arm. My success wasn't measured in promotions or bylines. It was measured in the seamless, effortless comfort of his life. The children became my new garden. I tended to them with the same focused love I once reserved for my botanical studies. I nurtured Michael's confidence and Chloe's creativity. I was the keeper of their secrets, the healer of their scraped knees, the weaver of their bedtime stories. I knew the name of every one of their teachers, the allergies of all their friends, the precise way Chloe liked her sandwiches cut, with the crusts removed in perfect right angles. I remember one afternoon, Chloe was about 7. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her tongue stuck out in concentration, as she painted a picture of a vibrant, impossible-looking flower. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and serious. "Mommy," she asked, "what did you want to be when you grew up?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I was standing at the sink, my hands submerged in soapy water, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I saw a flash of another life. A woman in a khaki vest, a magnifying glass in her hand, leaning over a rare bloom in the misty air of a rainforest. The image was so vivid, so real, it made my heart ache. But I just dried my hands, smiled and said, "This, honey. All I ever wanted was to be your mum." I wasn't entirely lying. Being their mother was the most profound and love-filled experience of my life. But it wasn't the whole truth. And in that moment, I realized I had been telling myself that half-truth for so long, I had almost convinced myself it was the complete story. Richard's career soared, just as he said it would. We got the bigger house, the better cars, the vacations to places I'd only ever seen in magazines. Our life looked perfect from the outside, a portrait of the American dream, and Richard was the artist. I was just the canvas he painted it on. My own colours had long since been covered over. I handled everything: the finances, the school runs, the parent-teacher conferences, the leaky faucets, the holiday planning. I was the chief operating officer of the household, a 24/7 unpaid, unacknowledged position. He was the CEO, the one who went out into the world and brought back the resources. It seemed like a fair trade. He was under so much pressure, he'd say, collapsing into his armchair at the end of the day. The weight of the world was on his shoulders. My job was to make sure the world inside our home was weightless for him. And so I did. I absorbed the anxieties, smoothed over the difficulties, and presented him with a life of serene domestic order. I was his soft place to land. My trust in him was the bedrock of my existence. It had to be. I had given up my own financial independence, my own career, my own identity, and placed them all in his hands for safekeeping. I believed he held my life with the same reverence I held his. I thought we were a team, that my silent, tireless work in the background was as valued as his public, lauded achievements. I believed that when he said, "I love you," it meant, "I see you. I value you. I honor the sacrifices you've made for us." I remember the day he made partner at the firm. It was the culmination of everything I, had worked for. He came home, his face flushed with triumph. He didn't just walk through the door, he burst through it. He picked me up and swung me around the kitchen, right there by the sink where I'd stood years before, lying to my daughter. "We did it, Ellie!" he shouted, his laughter echoing off the high ceilings. "We did it!" And in that moment, I felt it all. The pride, the relief, the shared victory. I looked into his eyes, the same fiery eyes that had captivated me in that tiny apartment, and I saw our entire life reflected there. It was all worth it. The packed-away textbooks, the abandoned career, the endless, invisible labor. It had all led to this. We had built this perfect life together. He was the architect, and I was the foundation, strong, steady, and completely hidden from view. A foundation is meant to be the most solid part of a house. It's not supposed to crack. It's not supposed to crumble and reveal that it was built on nothing but sand and secrets. I trusted him, with my youth, with my dreams, with my very self. He was the one person in the world I believed would never, ever let me fall. That belief was the air I breathed, the ground I walked on. And I never once thought to look for the fault lines, the tiny hairline fractures that were spreading silently right beneath my feet. I was too busy making sure his world was perfect. I never realized my own was about to shatter. The first thing that hits you isn't the cruelty, it's the quiet. A profound, hollow quiet that settles in your bones the moment you cross the threshold of a life that is no longer your own. When my David passed, the silence in our little house was one of grief. It was heavy, but it was ours. The silence in my son Mark's house was different. It was the silence of a space that had no room for me. I arrived with 2 suitcases and a heart full of a fragile hope. Hope that I could be useful, that I could be a grandmother, a mother, a presence that mattered. Mark had hugged me tight at the door, his big arms a familiar comfort from a life ago when he was just a boy. "We're so glad you're here, Mum," he'd said, and I believed him. Jessica, my daughter-in-law, stood behind him, a smile perfectly painted on her face. It was a beautiful smile, the kind you see in magazines, but it didn't touch her eyes. Her eyes were like polished stones, smooth and impenetrable. "Welcome, Sarah," she said, her voice a pitch-perfect melody of welcome. She didn't call me Mom. Not then. Not ever. My room was at the end of the hall, next to the laundry. It was small, with a single window that looked out onto the neighbor's brick wall. It was painted a sterile, forgettable beige. "We just cleared it out," Jessica explained, gesturing vaguely. "It was mostly for storage. But it's cozy, isn't it?" Cozy was one word for it. Confining was another. But I was grateful. I reminded myself of that a dozen times as I unpacked my life into the small closet and single dresser. I was a guest. No, I was family. I had to remember that. The first dinner was a study in subtle geometry. The dining table was a beautiful dark wood, set for 4. Mark, Jessica, and my grandchildren, 7-year-old Leo and 5-year-old Maya. I stood awkwardly in the doorway until Mark pulled out a chair for me at the head of the table, a place of honor. I felt a blush of relief. But then Jessica glided in, carrying a pot of steaming pasta. "Oh no, Mark, that won't do," she said, with a light, tinkling laugh. "Sarah, you sit here." She indicated a small, cushioned stool she'd pulled up to the corner of the table, not quite part of the main rectangle. "It's just easier for you to get in and out, and you won't be trapped in the corner." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. It was also the first line drawn in the sand. I was not part of the square. I was an addendum, a footnote. I sat on the stool, my knees higher than my hips, feeling like a child perched at the adults' table. They passed the salad bowl, their arms crossing in front of me, a web of familial connection that I was just outside of. I had to ask for it to be passed. My voice felt like a pebble dropped into a deep well, the splash barely audible over their chatter about school and work and a vacation they were planning. That night, as I lay in the sterile beige room, I could hear the low murmur of the television from the living room. It was the show David and I used to watch together. I crept out, my heart longing for a sliver of normalcy. The living room was empty, the TV remote on the coffee table. I picked it up, but when I pressed the button for the channel, a blue screen popped up. This channel is not included in your package. Please enter PIN to upgrade. The next morning, Jessica found me in the kitchen. "Oh, Sarah," she said, her voice laced with that same bright, false sympathy. "I should have mentioned. We lock the premium channels and the streaming services. You know, for the kids. We don't want them stumbling onto anything. Here." She handed me a different remote, smaller and simpler, with worn-out buttons. "This one gets the basic local channels. I'm sure you'll find something." I took the plastic remote. It felt cheap and light in my hand, a toy. The message was clear. This is your world, and it is smaller than ours. The days began to bleed into one another, each one a fresh lesson in my own irrelevance. The knife wasn't a single, swift blow. It was 1,000 tiny, paper-thin cuts, so small you could almost convince yourself they weren't happening. My coffee mug, the one I'd brought from home with a faded picture of a lighthouse on it, disappeared from the cabinet. When I asked, Jessica smiled her polished smile. "Oh, that old thing?" It had a little chip in the rim. "I wouldn't want you to cut yourself." In its place on the counter was a plastic tumbler, the kind you get at a fast food restaurant. "This is much safer," she said. "Lighter for you to hold." From that day on, everything I used was plastic. A plastic plate, a plastic bowl, plastic cutlery that bent if I tried to cut a piece of chicken too forcefully. The rest of the family ate from heavy, earth-toned ceramic plates, their silver forks and knives clinking with a sound of permanence, of belonging. My meals were a quiet, dull thud of plastic on plastic. I was temporary. I was breakable. I was a liability. I tried to help. God, I tried. I'd wake up early intending to make breakfast, only to find Jessica already at the stove, a whirlwind of efficient motion. "Good morning, Sarah," she'd chirp without looking at me. "Pancakes are on the warming tray. We've already eaten, but help yourself." I would sit alone at the corner of the silent table, eating lukewarm pancakes on my plastic plate, the syrup just a little too thin. I tried to do the laundry. I gathered my few things, a small pile of soft sweaters and slacks, and took them to the utility room. Jessica intercepted me at the door. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice losing its musical lilt for a fraction of a second. "Just my wash," I said quietly. "Oh no, you don't need to worry about that. I have a system. Whites, darks, delicates, you know?" She took the basket from my hands. "I'll get to it." My clothes would sit in the basket for days, sometimes a week. When I finally got them back, they'd be folded, but they smelled faintly of mildew, of being forgotten in a damp machine for too long. The way she spoke to her children about me was another cut. She never used my name. It was always, "Go tell Grandma dinner is ready," or "Ask Grandma if she needs anything." It wasn't Grandma Sarah, just the title, a role, not a person. To her friends on the phone, I was Mark's mother, a description, a relationship defined only by my son. Yes, Mark's mother is staying with us for a while. It's an adjustment. A sigh would follow, a theatrical sound of long-suffering patience that painted me as a burden before she even said another word. My son, my Mark, was caught in the middle of a fog I couldn't penetrate. I'd see him come home from work, tired and stressed. Jessica would meet him at the door with a kiss, a drink, a seamless story of her day. He saw a perfect home, a capable wife, happy children. He saw a mother who was being cared for. He didn't see the plastic cup. He didn't see the locked television channels. He didn't see the way I flinched when Jessica's voice took on that sharp, saccharine edge. One afternoon, I tried to talk to him. Jessica was out with the kids at soccer practice. We were alone in the house for the first time in weeks. He was on the couch, scrolling through his phone. "Mark?" I began, my voice trembling slightly. "Yeah, Mom?" he said, his eyes still glued to the screen. I was wondering if maybe I feel a little in the way here." He finally looked up, his brow furrowed. "In the way? What are you talking about? You're not in the way. It's just, Jessica has her routines, and I don't want to disrupt them. I feel like I'm not contributing." He smiled, a tired, dismissive smile. "Mom, that's the whole point. You're not supposed to contribute. You're supposed to relax. Jessica's got everything under control. She's a machine. Just let her take care of things. You've earned the rest." He thought it was a kindness. He thought he was giving me a gift. He couldn't understand that to be rendered useless is a kind of death. To have your hands tied when all you want to do is knead dough or fold a warm towel is a kind of prison. His words, meant to reassure me, sealed the door shut. He didn't see. He would never see. The indifference from my grandchildren was perhaps the cruelest cut of all. They were just children, echoing the world they saw. Leo, the older one, adopted Jessica's tone perfectly. One day, I reached for a cookie from the jar on the counter. "Grandma, no," he said, his little voice sharp and authoritative. "Mum says too much sugar is bad for old people's hearts." He wasn't being mean. He was just repeating a lesson he'd been taught. A lesson that I was old, fragile, and a problem to be managed. Maya was softer. Sometimes she would crawl into my lap with a picture book, her small, warm body a brief respite from the cold. She would point at the pictures, and I would feel a flicker of the grandmother I was supposed to be. But it never lasted. Jessica would appear as if from nowhere. "Maya, honey, come on. Let's not tire Grandma out. She needs her rest." She would scoop the child away, leaving me with empty arms and the lingering scent of my granddaughter's shampoo. I wasn't a comfort. I was a chore she was protecting her children from. The television became my only companion. I'd sit in the small armchair in my room, the one with the slightly sagging springs, and watch the grainy local news on the small TV Jessica had put in there. I learned the names of the daytime game show hosts and the anchors who reported on city council meetings. Their voices filled the silence. But I was always aware of the life happening just beyond my door. I could hear the surround sound from the real TV in the living room, the explosions from action movies, the swelling orchestra from dramas, the shared laughter of my family enjoying something together. A thick, soundproof wall stood between my world and theirs. One evening, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I walked into the living room. Mark and Jessica were on the couch, and the kids were on the floor, all of them watching some bright, animated movie. The air was warm and smelled of popcorn. It was a perfect family picture. I stood in the doorway, a ghost in my own life. No one looked at me. For a full minute, I just stood there, invisible. Finally, Mark noticed me. "Mom? You okay?" I thought I'd watch with you," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Jessica paused the movie. The sudden silence was deafening. She looked at me, not with her magazine smile, but with a flat, annoyed expression. "Sarah, the kids are watching this. It's very loud. Are you sure you wouldn't be more comfortable in your room?" "I don't mind the noise," I pleaded softly. She exchanged a look with Mark. It was a quick, darting glance, but it contained a whole conversation, a conversation that said, "See? She's being difficult. This is what I have to deal with." Mark cleared his throat. "Mom, it's late. Maybe Jessica's right. You need your rest." And just like that, I was dismissed. I turned and walked back to my beige room, the sound of the movie starting up again behind me. I didn't cry. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside me, a glacier of unshed grief. I sat in my sagging armchair and stared at the brick wall outside my window. It wasn't one thing. It was everything. It was the plastic cup that said I couldn't be trusted. It was the locked TV that said I wasn't part of their world. It was the repurposed storage room that said I was an afterthought. It was my son's blindness, my daughter-in-law's weaponized courtesy, my grandchildren's learned indifference. It was the slow, methodical erosion of my identity, particle by particle, day by day, until I was no longer Sarah, a wife, a mother, a woman who once had a life filled with love and lighthouses. I was just Grandma, just Mark's mother. An object to be managed, a problem to be solved, a quiet, inconvenient presence in the corner of a life that was marching on without me. And the most terrifying part was the dawning realization that this was not a temporary stay. This was the rest of my life. The silence was no longer just in the house. It was inside me. It was everything I couldn't say. And it was screaming. The first call was the hardest. My hand trembled so much I had to set the phone down on the kitchen counter and use my index finger to poke at the numbers on the screen, like an old woman who'd never seen a touchscreen before. Maybe I was. I felt ancient. The crisp, professional voice that answered on the other end did little to soothe the tremor in my own. "Harrison and Associates. How may I direct your call?" Yes. I need to make an appointment. With Mr. Harrison, if possible. It's a family matter." A family matter. The words tasted like ash. Family was a 4-letter word now, a weapon my own son had sharpened and used against me. The receptionist's voice was smooth, practiced. She found a slot for me 2 days later. 2 days to live with the decision, to let the acid of it churn in my stomach. For the first time in over a year, I was fighting back. And it felt less like empowerment and more like declaring a war I was already destined to lose. Mr. Harrison's office was what you'd expect. Leather chairs that sighed when you sat in them, dark wood paneling, and a faint scent of paper and old books. He was a man in his late 60s, with kind eyes that didn't quite match the shrewd set of his jaw. He listened patiently, his hands steepled under his chin, as I laid out the story. The words came out in a clumsy, halting rush, tripping over each other, heavy with shame. I told him about David, my husband, his sudden death in the car accident 2 years ago. I told him about the fog of grief that followed, a thick grey blanket I'd wrapped myself in, unable to face the world. I told him about Mark, my son, our son, how he'd stepped up, how he'd handled everything, the estate, the bills, the business David had built from nothing. "Just sign here, Mum," he'd say, his voice soft, full of a concern that I now understood was pure performance. "Don't you worry about a thing." And I hadn't. I'd signed. I'd signed away the house. I'd signed away my control of the business accounts. I'd signed power of attorney, believing I was a burden and he was my saviour. I had made a terrible, catastrophic mistake, my biggest one. I'd trusted my own child. He said it was to protect the assets, Mr. Harrison, to streamline things while I was unwell. The word felt inadequate. Unwell. I'd been drowning. "And now?" Mr. Harrison asked, his gaze steady. "Now I'm better. And I've been asked to leave my home. He's selling it. He said the documents are all in order, that it's his to sell. My name isn't even on the deed anymore." He leaned back, the leather chair groaning in protest. "Mrs. Gable, I'll be frank with you. This is an uphill battle. You're alleging that your son, your own flesh and blood, coerced you into signing legal documents during a period of emotional distress. He didn't coerce me. He lied. He told me they were for one thing when they were for another. The signatures on some of them, I don't even remember signing them. They don't look right." My voice cracked on the last words. Forgery. The accusation was so monstrous I could barely say it aloud. Mr. Harrison's eyes softened for a moment. "I understand this is difficult, but from a legal standpoint, you signed. You were of sound mind, legally speaking. Grief is not grounds for invalidating a contract. Your son will claim he was acting in your best interest. He'll say you were incapable of managing your affairs and he stepped in to prevent a financial catastrophe. But it's my home. David built this house. We built this life. I know. The first thing we need to do is file a preliminary injunction to try and halt the sale. But to do that, we need proof. Something more than a feeling. Do you have anything? Any emails? Any texts? Any witnesses who heard him say these documents were for a different purpose?" My heart sank. That was the problem, wasn't it? The second great obstacle. My struggle wasn't just with Mark. It was with a ghost. The ghost of the woman I used to be. The grieving widow who pushed everyone away. After David died, I had closed myself off. My sister, Carol, had tried to reach out, but I'd ignored her calls. Friends had stopped by with casseroles and condolences, but I'd pretended I wasn't home. The only person I'd spoken to, the only person I'd leaned on, was Mark. He had isolated me perfectly, and I had let him. I had locked my own cage. "No," I whispered. "There's no one. It was just him and me." Mr. Harrison nodded slowly. "All right. It's not ideal, but it's not impossible. I'll start by requesting full discovery of all financial records and the original copies of every document you signed. We can have a forensic handwriting analyst look at them. But be prepared. This will get ugly. Your son will fight back." Ugly didn't even begin to cover it. The first letter arrived a week later. It wasn't from Mark. It was from a law firm I'd never heard of. Sloan, Decker and Finch. The paper was thick, creamy, and felt heavy with menace. My hands shook as I slit the envelope. It was a cease and desist letter, a formal response to Mr. Harrison's initial filing. But it was the language within it that made the blood drain from my face. It spoke of my history of emotional instability. It referenced a brief period, years ago, after a miscarriage, when I had been prescribed anti-anxiety medication. It mentioned my profound grief after David's passing, framing it not as a natural response, but as a prolonged depressive episode, rendering me incapable of rational decision-making. It was a character assassination, drafted by my son and signed by his expensive lawyers. Every vulnerability I had ever shown him, every moment of weakness, had been catalogued and was now being used as a weapon. He was painting me as a hysterical, incompetent woman, and himself as the dutiful son forced to take control to save the family from my erratic behavior. I sank onto the bottom step of the staircase, the letter crinkling in my fist. This was the true face of the fight. It wasn't just about a house. It was about my sanity, my identity, my entire life being rewritten by the child I had raised. The pain was a physical thing, a cold blade twisting in my gut. I remembered him as a little boy, crying after falling off his bike, his face buried in my shoulder as I promised him everything would be okay. Where was that boy? Who was this cold, calculating stranger who knew my deepest wounds and was now pressing on them with all his might? The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of anxiety and fruitless searching. Mr. Harrison had been clear. Find something. Anything. So I searched. I turned the house upside down, transforming my home into a forensic site. I waded through 2 decades of memories packed into dusty boxes in the attic. Old tax returns, birthday cards, photo albums filled with images of a smiling, happy family that felt like a lie. Every picture of Mark was a fresh betrayal. Mark at his high school graduation, his arm around me. Mark on his wedding day, dancing with me, whispering in my ear how he'd be lost without me. It was all a performance. I tried calling my sister, Carol. Her husband, Tom, answered. His voice was cool, distant. Elena? Carol's busy? Tom, please. I just need to talk to her. It's about Mark. You have to know what he's doing is wrong. There was a long pause. I could hear Carol's voice, a faint murmur in the background. Elena, Tom said, his tone hardening. Mark explained the situation to us. He said you haven't been well. He's just trying to manage things so you don't have to worry. Maybe you should just let him handle it. He loves you. He loves me. The words were so absurd I almost laughed. He was trying to make me homeless, and they thought it was an act of love. Mark had gotten to them first. He'd woven his narrative, painting me as the fragile, confused mother he had to protect. My own sister, the one who held my hand at our father's funeral, was siding with him. The second door had slammed shut in my face. My attempts to find other allies were just as futile. David's old business partner, a man who had been a friend for 30 years, refused to take my call. A message was relayed through his secretary. He didn't want to get involved in a private family dispute. One by one, the people I thought I could count on turned away, either believing Mark's lies or too afraid to be caught in the crossfire. I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The guilt was a constant companion, a heavy cloak I couldn't shrug off. Was this my fault? Had I been a bad mother? Had I done something to create this monster? I replayed my life, searching for the moment things went wrong, the point where the loving son became a predator. Every memory was tainted. Every choice I'd made felt like a mistake. At night, I'd lie awake, the house groaning around me, and I'd fight the urge to just give up, to call Mark, to beg, to tell him he could have the house, he could have everything, if he would just be my son again. But I knew that boy was gone forever. This fight was all I had left. Mr. Harrison called with bad news. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive. The expert says the signatures are consistent with your own, but show signs of, let's call it, distracted application. As if you signed them without paying much attention. It's not enough to prove forgery, Elena. It just proves you were grieving and not focused. In fact, it almost helps their case. Of course it did. Mark was clever. He wouldn't have made it obvious. He probably gave me a stack of 10 legitimate papers to sign for the insurance and slipped his forged documents in the middle. The power of attorney, the deed transfer. I would have just scrawled my name, my mind a million miles away, lost in memories of David. I was running out of time. The injunction was temporary. Mark's lawyers were filing motion after motion to have it lifted. The legal bills were piling up, draining what little I had left in my personal savings. Hope was a dwindling resource, a flickering candle in a hurricane. I was losing. One bleak, rainy afternoon, I found myself in David's old workshop in the basement. I hadn't been down there since he died. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust and varnish, a ghost of his presence that made my throat ache. He'd spent hours down here, crafting beautiful furniture from raw timber. It was his sanctuary. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was just seeking refuge. I ran my hand over the smooth, worn surface of his workbench. I touched the tools hanging in their perfect, ordered rows on the pegboard. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. It was a museum of a life that was gone. My eyes fell on the custom-built desk he'd made for himself, tucked into a corner. It was a masterpiece of cherry wood, with intricate joints and a deep, polished finish. It was the last piece he ever completed. I sat down in his old chair, the worn leather cool against my skin, and for the first time in a long time, I cried. Not quiet, desperate sobs, but a raw, ragged wail of grief and rage and helplessness. When the storm passed, I was left with a hollow emptiness. I slumped forward, my head on the desk, my fingers tracing the grain of the wood. And then I felt it. A tiny, almost imperceptible seam on the underside of the desktop, right where my fingers were resting. It was so fine it was almost invisible. My heart gave a little thump. David had loved secrets. Secret compartments, hidden drawers. It was a game we used to play. He'd build something and challenge me to find its hidden feature. With trembling fingers, I pressed on the area around the seam. Nothing. I pushed. I pulled. Still nothing. Then I remembered his trick. It was never about force. It was about finding the right sequence. I ran my fingers along the inside of the knee hole, feeling for a catch. And there it was. A small, wooden button, disguised as part of the support structure. I pressed it. A soft click echoed in the silent workshop, and a shallow, felt-lined drawer slid open from the front of the desk, a drawer that had no handle, no visible outline. I held my breath, my mind racing with possibilities. A hidden will, a letter, a secret stash of cash. The drawer was almost empty. Inside lay a few stray paperclips, a spare key to his old truck, and a small black object about the size of a thumb drive. It was a digital voice recorder, one he used to dictate notes and ideas for his projects when he was on the road. It felt anticlimactic, disappointing. What good was this? I picked it up, ready to toss it back in the drawer and surrender to my despair, but I hesitated. I turned it over in my hand. It was a simple, cheap thing. I pressed the power button. Nothing. The battery was dead. Of course it was. For 3 days, the recorder sat on my kitchen counter, a silent black rectangle taunting me. I had to order a specific charger for it online, a relic from a decade ago. The wait was agonizing. Part of me knew it was a fool's errand, a desperate grasp at a non-existent straw. Mark's lawyers had filed another motion. The hearing was in a week. Time was almost up. The day the charger arrived, my hands were sweating. I plugged it in, the tiny red light blinking to life. I left it there for hours, too scared to touch it, too terrified of what I might, or might not, find. What if it was just empty? What if it was filled with rambling notes about dovetail joints and wood stains? The disappointment would be crushing. That evening, I finally worked up the courage. I carried it into the living room, turned off the television, and sat in the silence. The house was dark, except for a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. I pressed the power button. The small screen lit up. List of files. There were over 50 recordings. I scrolled through them. Idea for Henderson table. Note to call lumber yard. Measurements for bookcase. It was just as I'd feared. It was David's audio notepad. I felt a fresh wave of grief hearing his voice, so clear and strong, filling the silent room. He was talking about sanding techniques, about the price of maple versus oak. He was so alive in these recordings. I listened to a dozen of them, each one a small, painful reminder of the man I had lost. I was about to give up, to shut it off, when my thumb hovered over one of the last files. The date was 2 days before the accident. The title was innocuous. Insurance follow-up. I almost skipped it. It sounded mundane, but something made me press play. David's voice filled the room again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a memo to himself. It was a phone call. The audio quality was tinny, but clear. "Don't understand, Mark," David was saying. His voice was tight, strained. "The numbers aren't adding up. I'm looking at the quarterly statement from the supplier, and I'm looking at the withdrawal you made from the business account. There's a $15,000 discrepancy." My blood ran cold. I sat bolt upright, clutching the recorder. A younger voice answered, a voice I knew as well as my own. It was Mark. He sounded defensive, a little flustered. Dad, it's a clerical error. The accounting software has been buggy. I was going to sort it out on Monday. A buggy software doesn't make 15 grand disappear, son. David's voice was like steel. This is the third clerical error in 6 months. I let the first 2 slide. I thought you were just learning the ropes. But this is a pattern. I don't know what you're implying, Mark said, his voice rising. I'm not implying anything. I'm asking. Where is the money, Mark? The silence on the recording stretched for a full 10 seconds. I could feel the tension crackling through the tiny speaker. I needed it, Mark finally mumbled. It was a loan. I was going to pay it back. My credit cards were maxed out. Jessica, she wanted that new car. A loan? David's voice was heavy with a disappointment that cut me to the core. You take a loan from a bank, Mark. You don't steal from your own family, from the business I'm building for you, for your future. It's not stealing. I was going to put it back before you even noticed. But I did notice. The finality in David's voice was chilling. I'm on my way home now. We're going to sit down at the kitchen table, you, me, and your mother, and we are going to go through every single line of these books. This stops tonight. There was a click. The call ended. I sat there, frozen in the dim light. The recorder was silent in my hand, but the words echoed in my head, a deafening roar. I'm on my way home now. This stops tonight. But he never made it home. The police report said he'd lost control on a wet road, a tragic, random accident. But it wasn't random. My son had been stealing from us. My husband had found out. And hours after confronting him, my husband was dead. The narrative Mark had so carefully constructed, of the dutiful son stepping in to save his grieving, incompetent mother, shattered into a million pieces. This wasn't about protecting me. It was never about that. It was about control. He needed me out of the way, declared mentally unfit, stripped of all power, so that no one would ever look at the books, so no one would ever discover what David had discovered. The forgery, the lies, the campaign to discredit me. It was all just a cover-up for a crime that might be so much worse than theft. I looked around the room, at the house David had built, at the life we had made. It wasn't just my home I was fighting for anymore. I was fighting for him, for the truth. The cold, hard weight of the voice recorder in my palm no longer felt like a disappointment. It felt like a weapon. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I was furious. The war had just begun. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the apartment, a low, monotonous thrum that had become the soundtrack to my life. For weeks, it had been a sound of emptiness, of a life hollowed out. But that morning, it sounded different. It sounded like a starting pistol. I sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the swirling patterns in my cold coffee, but I wasn't seeing them. I was seeing a chessboard, one that had been set up and played without me, where I had been a pawn sacrificed in the opening moves. Catherine's voice from our phone call yesterday still echoed in my ears, dripping with that syrupy false concern she had perfected. Eliza, darling, we do worry. You're just not built for this kind of pressure. Your father, God rest his soul, wanted to protect you. And that's all Leo and I are doing. Protecting his legacy. And you. Protecting. They used that word like a shield, but it was a cage. They had protected me right out of my father's company, out of my own home, and almost out of my own mind. The grief after Dad's passing had been a fog, and they had been my diligent, guiding hands, leading me straight off a cliff while assuring me it was solid ground. They had shown me documents I was too numb to read, whispered about complexities I was too exhausted to question, and patted my hand, while they systematically dismantled everything he had built for me, for us. Now they had it all: the company, the house, the reputation. And I had this small, sterile apartment and a refrigerator that hummed a funeral dirge, until today. Today, the dirge was becoming a war drum. I pushed the coffee cup away, the ceramic scraping against the cheap laminate of the table. I stood up, walked to my closet, and pulled out a grey suit. Not one of the fashionable, modern ones Catherine favoured, but a simple, classic, almost severe suit my father had insisted I buy years ago. "You never know when you need to be taken seriously, Ellie," he'd said, a twinkle in his eye. "Sometimes the armour you wear isn't for a battle. It's for the negotiation before it." It felt strange against my skin, foreign after months of soft sweaters and leggings, the uniform of the grieving and defeated. But as I buttoned the jacket, I felt a straightening in my spine that had nothing to do with the tailored fabric. I looked at myself in the mirror. The haunted look was still in my eyes, but for the first time there was something behind it, a flicker of cold, hard light. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was Catherine, a picture of a ridiculously ornate floral arrangement. The text read, "For the lobby. What do you think, darling? A bit of life in the old place? Leo thinks it's too much, but what does he know about aesthetics?" For a moment, the old Eliza, the one who would have felt a pang of exclusion and sadness, surfaced. The old place. She called my father's life's work the old place. I took a deep breath, pushing the emotion down until it was a small, dense stone in my gut. I typed back, my fingers moving with a new, deliberate calm. "It's beautiful, Catherine. You have such a wonderful eye for these things. It really brightens the place up." A perfect, supportive, meaningless reply, the kind a harmless, slightly dim-witted stepdaughter would send. I put the phone down, face up, on the counter. Let them think I was sitting here, admiring their floral choices. Let them feel comfortable. Let them feel secure. Arrogance was a weakness, and theirs was a cavern. I was going to use it to bury them. My first stop was not a gleaming downtown law firm. It was a small, unassuming brownstone in a quieter part of the city, with a single brass plate by the door that read, "Arthur Vance, Attorney at Law." Mr. Vance had been my father's lawyer for 30 years. He was semi-retired, a man who preferred paper to pixels and phone calls to emails. Catherine and Leo, in their rush to modernize and install their own people, had dismissed him as a relic. They'd sent him a fruit basket and a curt letter thanking him for his service. They had no idea he was the keeper of every secret, every deal, every handshake my father had ever made. The office smelled of old books and lemon polish. Arthur, a man with a frame as thin as a bird's and eyes as sharp as a hawk's, greeted me not with pity, but with a quiet, appraising look. He poured 2 cups of tea, his hands steady. "Eliza," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "I was wondering when you'd call. I'm sorry it took so long, Arthur. I wasn't myself." He nodded, taking a slow sip of tea. "Grief is a heavy coat. It's hard to see the path when you're wearing it. But your father, Richard, was a planner. He planned for sunny days, and he planned for storms. I have a feeling he planned for this too." My heart beat a little faster. "What do you mean?" "Your stepmother and stepbrother were very efficient," he said, a note of distaste in his voice. "They presented a revised corporate structure, new bylaws, and a series of documents signed by you, granting them majority control and executive authority, all perfectly legal on the surface." "I signed them," I whispered, the shame hot on my face. I was in a daze. They said it was just streamlining things, to make it easier for me while I was, you know. "Of course you did," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "They used your pain against you. It's the oldest, cruelest trick in the book. But Richard was a suspicious man. He trusted people, but he never trusted fate. He set up redundancies, fail-safes. He called them his ghosts in the machine. The question is, can we find them? I leaned forward, my hands clasped on his worn mahogany desk. How? First, we do nothing. We let them believe they've won. Let them get comfortable in their new chairs. Let them redecorate the lobby. He gave a thin, knowing smile. And second, you need to remember. Think back, Eliza, to conversations you might have thought were unimportant, to places he might have kept things. A safe deposit box they don't know about? An old storage unit? A private server? Richard was old school, but he wasn't a fool. He embraced technology when it served his purposes. He loved hiding things in plain sight. We talked for 2 hours. He didn't make promises. He didn't offer false hope. He asked questions, hard questions, about my father's habits, his private conversations, his travels. It wasn't a therapy session. It was an intelligence debriefing. As I left, he placed a hand on my shoulder. Your father's greatest strength wasn't his business acumen, Eliza. It was his patience. Be his daughter in that, at least. Back in my car, I didn't immediately start the engine. I just sat, the quiet hum of the street a world away. Patience. He was right. My anger was a fire, and if I let it burn wild, it would consume me and nothing else. I needed to bank it, turn it into a focused, white-hot flame that could cut through steel. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Leo. Hey, sis. Mum's going a bit crazy with the redecorating. Wants to do your old man's office next. You don't have anything personal left in there, do you? We can box it up for you if you want. My father's office, the one place in that entire building that was a sanctuary, the smell of his leather chair, the worn spot on the carpet where he always tapped his foot, the faint scent of the pipe tobacco he'd quit a decade ago, but that had somehow seeped into the walls. The thought of Catherine's gaudy taste and Leo's smug face in that room made my vision swim with red. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and channeled Arthur's advice. Patience, I typed back. No, I think I got everything. Thanks for checking, Leo. Do whatever you think is best. I trust your judgment. The 3 dots appeared and disappeared for a full minute before his reply came. Great. Talk soon. He was surprised. He'd expected a fight, a tearful plea. He'd expected the weak, emotional sister he thought he knew. The fact that I had given in so easily would make him feel powerful. It would also make him careless. Good. My next stop was a coffee shop downtown, the kind with loud music and uncomfortable chairs. It was the last place anyone who knew my family would expect to find me. I was meeting Sarah. We'd been roommates in college, inseparable until a stupid fight, and the pressures of post-grad life had pushed us apart. I hadn't spoken to her in 3 years, but Sarah wasn't just an old friend. She was a forensic accountant. She spent her days digging through the digital and paper graveyards of bankrupt companies and embezzling executives. She was, for lack of a better word, a hunter. She was already there, looking just the same, only more polished. When she saw me, her professional mask slipped for a second, and she looked genuinely worried. Ellie, she said, standing to give me a brief, awkward hug. You look thin. It's the latest diet, I said, with a weak smile. Grief and betrayal. I don't recommend it. We sat, and the first 10 minutes were a stilted dance of apologies and catch-ups. Then the air cleared. So, she said, stirring her latte, your text was cryptic. Need your specific brand of magic. You're not in trouble, are you? I am, I said, leaning in. But I'm trying to get out of it. Sarah, I need you to look at something for me. Off the books, quietly. Her eyes narrowed, the friendly warmth replaced by a focused intensity I remembered from 1,000 all-night study sessions. What am I looking at? My father's company. My company. Or what's supposed to be my company. I think my stepmother and stepbrother are cooking the books. I think they have been for a long time, even before my father died. They've diluted my shares, created shell corporations, moved assets. I don't know. I just have a feeling. A deep, sick feeling that what they've done is more than just a hostile takeover. It's theft on a grand scale. She was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on my face. She was reading me, looking for the cracks, for the hysteria. She didn't find any. To do this properly, I'd need access, she said slowly. Server logs, accounting software, internal emails, transaction histories. Without that, I'm just guessing in the dark. I can't get you that, I said. Not yet. But what if I could get you something else? A starting point. My father's personal records, his old laptops, hard drives, things from before they took over. That could work, she said, nodding. It's like financial archaeology. You look at the old bones to see how the new monster was built. But Eliza, if you do this, if I do this, there's no going back. If they find out we're digging, they'll bury everything so deep no one will ever find it. And they'll bury you, too. They already think I'm buried, I said, my voice steady. They're just waiting for the dirt to settle. I have nothing left to lose, Sarah. She held my gaze, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. Okay, Ellie. Let's go grave robbing. Leaving the coffee shop, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in a year. Camaraderie. I wasn't alone anymore. I had Arthur's wisdom and Sarah's skills. But they both needed something from me. They needed the key, the starting point, the ghost in the machine. And I had to pray I could find it. Which brought me to the house I grew up in, which was now Catherine's palace. I had to get in. Specifically, I had to get into the attic. My father was a sentimental man, but he was also pragmatic. He kept everything. Decades of tax records, old business proposals, blueprints for projects that never happened. It was all stored in filing cabinets in the dusty, sprawling attic. He also kept a safe up there. An old, heavy, dial combination safe that wasn't connected to any modern alarm system. He used to joke it was his real-time capsule. Getting in was the easy part. I still had a key. The hard part was getting in and out without being seen. Catherine and Leo were at the office, redecorating. The housekeeper, Maria, had Thursdays off. I had a window, a small, dangerous window. I parked my car a few blocks away and walked, my heart pounding a rhythm that was part fear, part adrenaline. The neighborhood was quiet, sleepy in the midday sun. Letting myself in through the side door felt like a violation. The house smelled different. Catherine's cloying floral perfume had replaced the familiar scent of my father's books and my mother's lemon polish. New paintings hung on the walls, abstract splashes of colour that looked expensive and felt empty. They had erased him. They had erased us. I didn't linger. I went straight for the stairs, my steps silent on the thick new runner. The pull-down cord for the attic was in the hallway of the second floor. I tugged it, and the old wooden stairs groaned in protest as they unfolded. The air that wafted down was hot, still, and smelled of aging paper and cedar. It smelled like memory. It smelled like my father. I pulled myself up, my suit jacket catching on the frame. The heat was oppressive. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from a dormer window, and there, against the far wall, behind a stack of my old college textbooks and a ghost-draped armchair, was the safe. A hulking, dark green monster of a thing. I knelt in front of it, my hands trembling slightly as I wiped the dust from the brass dial. He'd taught me the combination when I was 16. A silly, convoluted series of numbers based on my birthday, my mother's birthday, and the year he founded the company. Just in case, Ellie Bean, he'd said, just in case of emergency. I don't think this was the emergency he'd had in mind. Right 22nd. My birthday. The dial clicked softly. Left past 22 to 14. Mum's birthday. Right to 68. The year it all started. I held my breath and pulled the heavy handle. For a heart-stopping second, it didn't budge. I pulled again, gritting my teeth, and with a deep, groaning thunk, the seal broke, and the door swung open. The contents weren't what I expected. There were no stacks of cash or bearer bonds. Instead, there were several thick, leather-bound ledgers, the kind accountants used before everything went digital. There was a small velvet pouch containing a single old-fashioned skeleton key, and there were 3 black external hard drives, the rugged kind designed to withstand abuse. I took one of the ledgers and opened it. My father's neat, precise handwriting filled the pages. It wasn't business accounting. It was a private journal, a log, dates, names, and notes. I flipped to a page near the end, dated just a few months before he died. My eyes scanned the lines. Met with C&L today, Re. The Sterling acquisition. Their proposal is aggressive. Too aggressive. Smells of leverage and debt. Leo is hungry. Catherine encourages it. She sees the company as a vehicle, not a legacy. Worried about their influence. They see Ellie as an obstacle. A sentimental fool. Must put a firewall in place. The V protocol. The V protocol. Vance. Arthur Vance. This was it. This was the ghost. I quickly packed the hard drives and the most recent ledger into my briefcase. I couldn't take everything, not without it being noticed. But this was enough. This was the start. As I closed the safe, my fingers brushed against a small taped envelope on the inside of the door. My name was written on it in his familiar script. Ellie. I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A letter. My dearest Ellie Bean. It began. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the world has not been as kind as I'd hoped. Do not despair. You are smarter than you think and stronger than you know. You are my daughter. The people you are facing believe in rules, but they only follow the ones that benefit them. They have forgotten that I built the game they are playing. The ledgers are my memory. The drives are my teeth. And the key. The key opens the first box I ever bought. It's not in a bank. It's somewhere much closer to home. Somewhere you loved to hide as a child. Trust Arthur. Trust your gut. And never ever let them see you coming. All my love, Dad. Tears blurred my vision. Not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming, fierce gratitude. He hadn't left me defenseless. He had left me an arsenal. Somewhere you loved to hide as a child. The old, hollowed-out oak tree at the bottom of the garden. The place I'd called my castle. I closed the safe, wiped away my tears, and retraced my steps. I moved with a new purpose, a cold certainty settling in my bones. I let myself out of the house, the click of the lock feeling final, like the closing of a chapter. My old life in that house was over. My new one was just beginning. Later that evening, I sat in my quiet apartment. The briefcase was on the table in front of me. I had called Sarah and told her I had what she needed. We would meet tomorrow. I had called Arthur and read him the note. He was silent for a moment, then simply said, "Richard, you magnificent bastard. I'll be ready." My phone buzzed. It was a group text from Catherine, including me and Leo, a photo of my father's office, now completely gutted. The old mahogany desk was gone, the leather chairs replaced by chrome and white plastic. The walls were a stark, sterile white. The only thing left was the view of the city skyline. Catherine's text read, "A fresh start for a new era. Out with the old, in with the new. Doesn't it look brighter already?" I looked at the picture, at the desecration of his memory, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just a profound, chilling calm. The fire in my gut was no longer a raging inferno. It was a pilot light, steady and waiting. They could have the office. They could have the furniture and the paintings. They were fighting over the empty shell. I was holding the soul. I typed my reply, my fingers steady. It looks amazing, so clean and modern. Dad would have loved it. I hit send, and then I turned my phone off, the screen going dark. The humming of the refrigerator filled the silence, but I no longer heard it. All I could hear was the quiet, satisfying click of a chess piece being moved into position. My position. My game. And I was just getting started. The air in the boardroom was recycled and cold, smelling faintly of expensive leather and quiet desperation. I smoothed the lapels of my simple black blazer, a nervous habit I was allowing myself for show. Across the polished mahogany table, Marcus Vance, my boss, my mentor once upon a time, was a portrait of effortless confidence. He smiled at the board members, a brilliant, predatory flash of white teeth. He looked like a man who had never known a moment of self-doubt, a man who believed the world was his to take. And for the past 6 months, he had been taking mine. My heart wasn't pounding. It was beating with a slow, heavy, deliberate rhythm, like a drum counting down to an execution. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind 1,000 times, played out every possible permutation, every question, every denial. The anger that had once felt like a forest fire in my chest had been cooled and forged into something much harder, much sharper. It was a blade of ice, and today I was going to use it. Mr. Henderson, the CEO, a man whose face was a permanent mask of weary authority, cleared his throat. Marcus, we're all eager to see what you've been working on. Project Chimera has been our highest priority, and you've assured us the prototype is ready for its first internal demonstration. Marcus's smile widened. He gave me a brief, condescending glance, the kind you'd give a pet that had learned a simple trick. Of course, Mr. Henderson. It's been a long road, a lot of sleepless nights, but I believe the results will speak for themselves. Elena here has been an invaluable assistant in collating the data. An assistant. I felt a dozen pairs of eyes flicker towards me. They saw a junior analyst, barely 2 years out of college, sitting at the far end of the table, here to take notes and run the slideshow. That's what he wanted them to see. That's the role he had so carefully crafted for me. For a moment, the memory of those nights threatened to surface. The fluorescent hum of the office lights at 3 a.m., the taste of stale coffee, the thrill of a breakthrough in the code. A thrill I had shared with no one but the 4 walls of my cubicle. He had taken those moments, packaged them, and was now preparing to sell them as his own. I pushed the memories down. They were fuel, nothing more. "Eleanor, if you would," Marcus said, gesturing to the large screen at the front of the room. He didn't even look at me. He was addressing his audience, the real players. I picked up the remote, my fingers cool and steady. I clicked the first slide. The project's codename, CHIMERA, appeared in bold, clean letters against a deep blue background. Below it, in a smaller font, Lead Architect, Marcus Vance. A muscle in my jaw tightened, but my expression remained placid, neutral. Marcus launched into his presentation. He was good, I had to give him that. He was a master salesman. He spoke with passion and conviction, using all the right buzzwords: synergy, scalability, disruptive innovation. He moved through the slides I had designed, explaining the complex architecture of the system with a fluency that was impressive for someone who had only read my summary reports. He was a gifted parrot, repeating the words he'd made me write for him, making them sound like his own native language. "The core of Chimera," he explained, pointing a laser at a complex flowchart on the screen, "is its predictive algorithm. We're not just analyzing existing data, we're modeling future market trends with an unprecedented 94% accuracy rate. This isn't just an evolution, it's a revolution." He paused for effect, letting the weight of his statement settle in the room. I could see the board members leaning forward, their faces lit with the green glow of projected profits. They were hooked. I remembered the night I cracked that algorithm. It wasn't in a flash of inspiration. It was a grueling, 48-hour marathon of trial and error, of debugging lines of code that made my eyes blur, of filling an entire whiteboard with equations until my hand cramped. I had finally collapsed on the office sofa at dawn, a triumphant, exhausted smile on my face. The next morning, I had excitedly explained the breakthrough to Marcus. He had listened intently, his eyes glinting. "Excellent work, Elena," he'd said, patting my shoulder. "Write up a full technical brief and send it to me. I'll handle the presentation to the board." Now, he was handling it. He clicked to the next slide, a simulation of the algorithm in action. Animated data points swirled and coalesced into a clear, upward trending graph. It was beautiful. It was my beautiful, intricate, impossible creation, and he was dancing with it in front of them all. "As you can see," Marcus continued, his voice resonating with pride, "the system is not only powerful, but elegant. The user interface is intuitive. The back-end processing is seamless. Every line of code has been optimized for maximum efficiency." He spent the next 20 minutes walking them through every feature, every module, every potential application. He fielded their preliminary questions with ease, deflecting technical queries with broad, confident strokes. He was painting a masterpiece with my colors. I let him finish. I let the room fill with murmurs of impressed approval. Mr. Henderson was beaming, already seeing the stock price soar. "Marcus, this is extraordinary," Henderson said, his voice thick with admiration. "Truly visionary work. This puts us 5 years ahead of the competition." "Thank you, sir," Marcus said, inclining his head in a show of false humility. "It was a team effort, of course." He gestured vaguely in my direction again, a magnanimous king acknowledging a stable boy. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. The air was thick with his victory. It was the perfect time to let it all curdle. I raised my hand slightly, not high enough to be demanding, just enough to be noticed. Mr. Henderson saw it. "Yes, Elena? Do you have something to add?" His tone was slightly impatient, as if I were a child interrupting adult conversation. "Just a question for Mr. Vance, if I may," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried in the suddenly silent room. Every eye turned to me. I could feel Marcus's gaze on me, sharp and annoyed. "Of course," he said, his smile tightening at the edges. I kept my eyes on him. "It's about the kernel's data compression subroutine, on slide 17. You mentioned its efficiency. I was just wondering if you could briefly elaborate on the decision to use a recursive fractal algorithm instead of a more conventional LZ77 variant. It's an unconventional choice, and I'm sure the board would be interested in the innovative thinking behind it." The room was utterly still. It was a deeply technical question, laced with jargon that would go over the heads of most of the board. But it wasn't for them. It was for him. It was the first stone, aimed directly at the foundation of his lie. Marcus didn't blink. He was a professional. "An excellent question, Eleanor. It speaks to your attention to detail." He paused, buying time. "The decision was based on scalability. The fractal model allows for a more dynamic and, responsive compression ratio, especially when dealing with the kind of volatile datasets Chimera is designed to handle." He was good. It was a plausible, high-level answer, but it was vague. It was the answer of a manager, not an architect. I nodded slowly, my expression one of thoughtful curiosity. "I see. So in that case, how did you overcome the inherent processing overhead issue? Recursive fractal calculations are notoriously CPU-intensive. A standard implementation would create a bottleneck that would cripple the system's real-time analysis capabilities. There must be a specific optimization you implemented to bypass that. I watched him. I watched the subtle shift in his posture. I saw the flash of panic in his eyes before he masked it with a condescending chuckle. "Elena, we can get into the technical weeds later," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "I'm not sure the board is interested in a deep dive into code optimization." "I am," a quiet voice said. It was David Chen, the company's chief technology officer. He was a quiet, brilliant man who rarely spoke in these meetings. He was looking at Marcus now, his head tilted. "It's a valid question. The bottleneck she's describing would be a fatal flaw. How did you solve it, Marcus?" The trap was sprung. Now it wasn't just the note-taker asking. Marcus's smile vanished. He cleared his throat. "It's a proprietary element of the code, a unique solution I developed. It involves asynchronous processing and a multi-threading approach to distribute the load." He was guessing. He was throwing out terms he'd read in my reports, stringing them together and hoping they made a coherent sentence. They didn't. Not in this context. "Asynchronous processing on a recursive function?" I asked, my voice still soft, still genuinely curious. "Wouldn't that create race conditions and data corruption unless you implemented a transaction locking system? But a lock would negate the speed benefits of multi-threading. It feels like you'd be solving one problem by creating two others." I wasn't looking at the board anymore. I was looking only at Marcus. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead now. He was a fish on a hook, and he was just beginning to realize it. "Look," he snapped, his composure finally cracking. "I wrote the damn thing. It works. The results speak for themselves. This isn't a code review." "You're right," I said. And for the first time, the chill I'd been holding back seeped into my voice. "It isn't. It's a presentation of your work, and you should be able to speak about it." I turned my gaze to Mr. Henderson and the rest of the board. "The solution to the bottleneck isn't in the code's logic. It's in the compiler." Chen, the CTO, leaned forward, his eyes narrowed in intense focus. "The compiler? What do you mean?" "I wrote a custom pre-compiler directive," I explained, my voice clear and steady. "It analyzes the recursive function during the compilation stage and unrolls the first 4 iterations of the fractal loop into a linear sequence. It essentially gives the CPU a head start, bypassing the most intensive part of the calculation without compromising the integrity of the algorithm. It reduces the processing load by nearly 60%. That's the secret. That's what makes Chimera possible." Silence. Chen stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. He understood. It was an elegant, brilliant, and completely non-obvious solution. The kind of thing you'd only know if you'd spent 100 hours staring at a debugger, trying to shave off milliseconds of processing time. That's impossible," Marcus stammered, his face turning a blotchy red. "She's lying. She's just an analyst. She wouldn't have the first clue how to do something like that." "Then you tell us, Marcus," Chen said, his voice flat. "Show us that part of the source code. Explain it." Marcus's jaw worked, but no sound came out. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an ally, an escape route. He found none. The faces staring back at him were cold, confused, and increasingly suspicious. Mr. Henderson looked from Marcus's panicked face to my calm one. "Ms. Reed, what are you suggesting?" I took a slow breath. This was the moment, the final turn of the screw. "I'm not suggesting anything, sir. I'm stating a fact. I am the lead architect of Project Chimera. I wrote every single line of its code. I designed the database schema. I developed the predictive algorithm. And I built the compiler directive that makes it all work." I paused, letting the words hang in the sterile air. "Marcus Vance was my project manager. He approved my expense reports and forwarded my weekly progress summaries up the chain of command after adding his name to the cover sheet. His sole contribution to this project was theft. A collective gasp went through the room. Marcus shot to his feet. This is absurd. It's slander. She's a disgruntled employee trying to sabotage a major company initiative. She has no proof. Proof is a funny thing, Marcus, I said, my voice dropping to an almost conversational tone. You think it's just about files and documents, but sometimes it's about authorship. It's about leaving a signature that only the artist can recognize. I looked at Mr. Henderson. Sir, with your permission, I'd like to run one final diagnostic on the prototype. Henderson, his face a thundercloud of confusion and fury, just nodded numbly. I turned back to the laptop connected to the projector. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I didn't use the mouse. I opened a command line interface, the black screen with its green text stark after the polished corporate presentation. What is she doing? Someone whispered. Marcus, you always told me that the best way to protect intellectual property was to hide it in plain sight, I said, my voice calm as I typed a long, complex string of characters. You said to build a fortress. I agreed, but I built my fortress a little differently. I hit enter. On the massive screen at the front of the room, the beautiful, swirling data simulation of Project Chimera froze. And then, slowly, letters began to resolve from the data points, like constellations appearing in the night sky. The board members leaned in, squinting. The swirling graph resolved into a single, elegant line of text hovering in the center of the screen. It read, Property of Eleanor Reed, coded and compiled. Timestamp. The exact date and time, 3 days ago. Below the text, a detailed log began to scroll, listing every file, every module, every subroutine. And next to each one, in the author field, were my initials, ER. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a dense, heavy, suffocating thing. It was the sound of a career ending. It was the sound of a lie shattering into a million pieces. I looked at Marcus. The blood had drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, waxy grey. He stared at the screen, his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide with the horror of a man watching his own ghost. He didn't understand. This wasn't just text on a screen. It was a digital watermark, woven into the very fabric of the program's visual output. A kill switch I had coded, triggered by a specific, encrypted command string that only I knew. He had presented his own execution. It's a Trojan horse, Marcus, I explained softly, for his benefit alone. I called it the Vance contingency. I embedded it 6 weeks ago, the day you told me to remove my name from the internal documentation and replace it with yours. I knew this day was coming. I've been logging every email, every file transfer, every conversation since. I have a complete record of you systematically stripping my name from my own work. I turned back to the board. The version you have is a prototype. It is watermarked and programmed to purge its core data in 24 hours. The complete, stable, and uncompromised version of Project Chimera is on a secure server, under my exclusive control. If you would like to discuss the future of this project, a project that I can confirm is 5 years ahead of the competition, I am prepared to do so. Under a new contract, of course. One that properly reflects my position as its sole creator. I stood up, my movements fluid and unhurried. I closed the laptop, the sudden blackness of the screen feeling like a final curtain call. The heavy silence was finally broken by Mr. Henderson. Marcus, he said, his voice dangerously low, a growl rumbling beneath the surface. Get out. Marcus didn't move. He just stood there, swaying slightly, a statue of a man hollowed out from the inside. Security! Henderson barked into the intercom on the table. Escort Mr. Vance from the premises. Immediately. 2 burly guards entered the room. They moved towards Marcus, who didn't even seem to see them. His eyes were still fixed on the blank screen, where his triumph had just died. As they led him away, his shoulder brushing past mine, I didn't look at him. I looked at the faces of the board members. They were staring at me now, not with pity or dismissal, but with a new, startling expression. It was a mixture of shock, awe, and a healthy dose of fear. They weren't looking at an assistant anymore. They were looking at the architect. I took my seat at the head of the table, in the chair Marcus had just vacated. It was still warm. "Now," I said, my voice crisp and clear in the silent room. "Let's talk about the real Project Chimera." The phone buzzed against the worn wood of my counter, a discordant sound in the symphony of my small cafe. Here, the only music was the gentle hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of ceramic on saucer, and the low hum of happy chatter. I had built this little world note by note, a sanctuary of real butter and genuine smiles. I glanced at the screen. It was a ghost's number, one I had buried so deep in my contacts, I was surprised it could still find a signal. My stepmother, Amelia. My hands, steady just a moment ago as I'd been dusting flour from an apricot tart, trembled slightly. I wiped them on my apron, a clean, crisp linen, and answered. Her voice, thick with a sweetness that had always felt like melted plastic, poured through the speaker. She spoke of the old bakery, our bakery, in that collective way she had of claiming my work. She didn't ask how I was. She never did. She just said they needed me, that things were difficult. She painted a picture of struggle, of legacy on the line, of a family in crisis. The family that had surgically removed me from its portrait. For a few days, I let her words curdle in the air. My life here was good. I woke with the sun, not with a knot of anxiety in my stomach. The scent of yeast and coffee was my own. Not a shared atmosphere heavy with unspoken resentment, but the call was a hook, and it had snagged on something deep inside me. Not love, not obligation, but a need for a final, quiet chord to end the dissonant symphony of my past. I knew I had to go back one last time, not for them, but for the girl I used to be. The one who left in the middle of the night, with nothing but a box of her grandmother's recipes and a shattered heart. The drive back to the town I'd fled felt like travelling through a faded photograph. The colours were muted, the memories sharp-edged. When I pulled up to the Gilded Spoon, the sign, once a cheerful, welcoming beacon, was peeling. One of the letters had fallen, so it now read, The Gilded Oon. It felt strangely appropriate. I pushed open the door. The little bell above it gave a pathetic, dusty tinkle, a shadow of its former cheerful jingle. The air inside was wrong. It used to smell of my grandmother's legacy. Warm bread, caramelized sugar, a hint of cinnamon and love. Now, it smelled of stale oil and desperation. The display cases, once overflowing with my creations, were sparsely populated with sad-looking, machine-perfect pastries that had no soul. Amelia and my stepsister, Chloe, were sitting at a corner table. They looked diminished. Amelia's perfectly coiffed hair seemed brittle, her designer dress a size too loose. Chloe, who had always radiated a kind of cruel, effortless glow, looked sallow. Her eyes, which used to dance with mockery when they looked at me, were now just tired. They stood as I approached, forcing smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The performance began immediately. "Oh, darling, you look wonderful," Amelia cooed. Reaching for a hug, I sidestepped by moving toward the counter. "City life agrees with you." "Hello, Amelia. Chloe?" I said, my voice even. It was a small victory, hearing it come out so steady. "We're so glad you came," Chloe mumbled, picking at a loose thread on her sweater. "Things have been, you know." I looked around the empty shop. "I can see. The next hour was a masterclass in manipulation. They spun a tale of hardship, of bad luck, of suppliers failing and customers being fickle. They never once mentioned their own lack of skill. They never mentioned the baking competition they had entered using my signature recipe, the one that won them the feature in a national magazine and pushed me out for good. They spoke of the bakery as a living thing that was dying, and I was its only hope. "We just can't replicate what you did," Amelia said, her voice cracking with practiced despair. "That touch, that magic, it came from your grandmother. Through you. It's in your blood." "The magazine wants to do a follow-up piece," Chloe added, the real reason for my summons finally slipping out. "They want to see the family behind the famous lavender honey cake. They want the recipe." And there it was. The reason for the ghost's call. Not to mend, not to apologize, but to take. Again. I let the silence hang in the air, thick and heavy, like unrisen dough. I watched them. I saw the desperate hope in their eyes, the same avarice that had been there all along, just stripped of its confident disguise. In that moment, I felt nothing. Not anger, not pity. Just a vast, quiet emptiness where the pain used to be. The wound had finally scarred over. I walked behind the counter, my fingers tracing the familiar scratches on the marble top. This was where I learned to knead dough, my grandmother's hands guiding mine. This was where I cried when my first soufflé fell. This was where I poured my soul into everything I made, only to have it served up as Chloe's creation. "I have something for you," I said softly. Their faces lit up, a grotesque parody of joy. I went out to my car and returned with a leather-bound journal. It was heavy in my hands. My grandmother's recipe book. The one they thought I had lost. The one I had memorized. Every page, every annotation, every flower smudge a part of my very being. I placed it on the counter between us. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. "Everything is in there," I said. The lavender honey cake, the cardamom buns, the sourdough starter she called Eleanor, every secret you ever wanted. Amelia reached for it, her hands shaking like a starved woman reaching for bread. Chloe just stared, her mouth slightly agape. You're just giving it to us?" Chloe stammered, suspicion warring with greed. "Yes," I said, and I meant it. This was my final gift, my final act of severance. Because I had finally understood something they never would. The magic wasn't in the ink on the page. It wasn't in the precise measurements or the secret ingredients. The magic was in the love. It was in the hands that made it. It was in the soul of the baker. I was giving them a book of spells in a language they would never be able to speak. Amelia clutched the book to her chest as if it were the crown jewels. "Thank you," she whispered, the words sounding hollow in the cavernous, empty bakery. "You won't regret this. We're family, after all." I gave a small, sad smile. "No, Amelia, we're not." I turned and walked toward the door. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel their eyes on me, their minds already churning, not with gratitude, but with plans. They had the book, but they didn't have the story. They had the words, but not the music. As I stepped outside, the sun felt impossibly warm on my face. The air smelled of distant rain and freedom. I got in my car and drove away, the sad, peeling sign of the gilded Oon shrinking in my rearview mirror until it was just a meaningless speck. I left without a single curse, without a raised voice. I left, taking nothing but my name, and leaving behind only a book full of ghosts they could never conjure. Months later, a customer in my bustling cafe, a woman who'd recently moved from my old hometown, mentioned it in passing. She was telling me how much she loved my pastries, how they felt authentic and real. "It's funny," she said, taking a bite of a scone. "There was a place back home, the Gilded Spoon. It had a bit of fame for a while, but it was so soulless. It shut down last month. They said they had the recipes, but none of it ever tasted right. I just smiled and poured her another cup of coffee. The house I had left was no longer filled with fake laughter or the silent screams of my stolen work. It was just an empty building now. I hadn't needed to burn it down. They had simply forgotten to tend the flame. My name was mine, my hands were mine, and the legacy of my grandmother wasn't trapped in a leather-bound book. It lived and breathed in every single thing I chose to create. The sweetest revenge, I learned, wasn't a bitter dish at all. It was the simple, warm taste of my own bread.